My name is Claire Mitchell, and I am 38 years old. And if you had told me 10 years ago that I would one day be sitting in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building, with my name on the lease, looking down at a city that once made me feel invisible, I would have laughed until I cried, because crying was something I did a lot of back then. Mostly alone, mostly at night, mostly after I had transferred money I didn't have into accounts that belonged to people who never once said thank you. People who shared my blood and called it love. People who looked me in the eye and told me I was selfish every single time I hesitated, every single time I asked a question, every single time I dared to wonder if what was happening to me was right. And I want to tell you this story from the very beginning, not because I want your sympathy, though I won't pretend the journey didn't hurt in ways that still leave marks, but because I kept records. I kept every single record, every transfer, every text message, every voicemail, every handwritten note, every receipt, every bank statement, every email, every conversation I ever had the foresight to screenshot. And I kept them not out of bitterness in the beginning. I kept them because something deep inside me, some quiet and stubborn voice that refused to be silenced. No matter how many times my mother told me I was too sensitive, or my father told me I was being dramatic, or my brother told me I needed to learn what family means, that voice told me that one day the truth would matter, that one day the numbers would speak louder than anyone's tears. And that day came, and when it came in a way that none of them saw arriving. So let me take you back to where this all started. Back to a small house on Delmore Street in Columbus, Ohio. Back to a family that looked perfectly normal from the outside, a mother and a father and 3 children. And a kitchen that always smelled like something was either burning or just about to. Back to a childhood that taught me very early that love in my family was never unconditional. It was always transactional. It was always earned. And for some of us in that house, no matter how hard we tried, the earning was never quite enough. And I was one of those people. I was the middle child, which sounds like a cliche, and I know that. But in my family, being the middle child meant something very specific. It meant being the invisible one. It meant being the responsible one. It meant being the one who was expected to hold things together while everyone else fell apart. My older brother Marcus was the golden child. He was charming and loud, and my father's favorite in a way that was never subtle, never hidden. Marcus could do no wrong. Marcus could come home drunk at 19, and my father would laugh it off. Marcus could lose a job, and my mother would cook his favorite meal and tell him something better was coming. Marcus was the sun in our family's solar system, and the rest of us just orbited him whether we wanted to or not. And then there was my younger sister Diane, who was my mother's favorite in an equally obvious and equally painful way. Diane was pretty in a way that made people stop and look. She had long dark hair and my mother's cheekbones, and a smile that could talk anyone into anything. And my mother treated her like she was made of something more fragile and more valuable than the rest of us. Diane got the new clothes and the extra portions, and the patient explanations and the long hugs. Diane got driven to school while Marcus and I walked. Diane got the bedroom with the window that caught the morning sun, while I slept in the room next to the boiler that rattled all winter long. And then there was me, Claire, the middle one, the steady one. The one who got good grades, not because anyone noticed, but because something in me needed to prove to myself that I was worth something, even if no one in that house was going to tell me so. I studied hard and I stayed quiet, and I learned very young how to make myself small enough not to take up too much space in a house where space was always someone else's priority. And I want to be careful here because I don't want you to think my parents were monsters. They weren't. They were just deeply flawed people who had their own wounds and their own blindnesses. And they passed those wounds and blindnesses down to their children the way people do, unconsciously and completely. My father Raymond worked at a processing plant for 22 years and came home tired in a way that went all the way down to his bones. He wasn't cruel, he was just absent, present in the room, but somewhere else entirely. And my mother Linda was the kind of woman who had given up her own dreams so long ago that she had stopped remembering what they were. And that made her sharp sometimes, sharp in the way that people get when they're carrying something they never asked to carry. And the sharpness landed on me more often than it landed on anyone else. I think because I was the one who reminded her most of herself. And that is a complicated kind of love, being someone's mirror when they don't like what they see. So I grew up learning to be useful. I grew up learning that my value in this family was tied directly to what I could contribute. And when I was young, that contribution was emotional. I was the peacekeeper, the one who talked Marcus down when he got into one of his rages, the one who sat with my mother when she cried without explanation, the one who helped Diane with her homework and braided her hair, and told her she was going to be okay even on nights when I wasn't sure I was going to be okay myself. And I thought this was love. I genuinely thought this was just what families did. I thought everyone lived like this. I didn't know yet that I was being trained to give without question, trained to sacrifice without complaint, trained to put everyone else's needs so far above my own that I eventually forgot I had needs at all. And then I turned 22 and I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in accounting. And I did it on scholarships and part-time jobs and ramen noodles and sheer stubborn will. Because my parents had not saved a single dollar for my education, they had saved some money for Marcus. But Marcus had spent 2 semesters at community college before dropping out to work at his friend's auto shop. And they had saved some money for Diane. But Diane had decided at 17 that college wasn't for her and had started dating a man named Troy, who my mother immediately loved because he had a truck and brought flowers to the house. So the money that had been theoretically set aside for education in our family had drifted away in various directions, none of which involved me. And I didn't complain. I want you to know that. I didn't sit across from my parents and demand fairness. I told myself I was proud of doing it on my own. And in some ways, I genuinely was. There was a real satisfaction in walking across that stage, knowing every dollar of that diploma had been mine. But there was also a grief underneath the pride. A quiet and persistent grief for the version of myself that had never once been prioritized. Never once been told you're the one we believe in most. Never once been handed something just because I deserved it. And I carried that grief the way I carried everything, quietly and without making a scene. And right after graduation, I got a job at a mid-sized accounting firm in Columbus called Hargrove Financial. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was a salary and benefits and a reason to get up every morning and put on professional clothes and feel like I was building something. And for about 6 months, I felt genuinely hopeful. I had a small apartment near the university district. I had a routine. I had colleagues who were friendly and a supervisor named Patricia who told me in my first performance review that I had exceptional instincts and a natural gift for finding patterns in numbers. And I remember going home that night and sitting on my second-hand couch in my small apartment and feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt seen. And then my phone rang, and it was my mother, and she was crying, and everything changed. Because when my mother cried, it was never just crying. It was a summons, it was a call to duty. It was the signal that Claire was needed and Claire would come. And I came. I always came. She told me that my father had hurt his back at work and was going to be out for several weeks, and that they were behind on the electric bill, and that the car needed a repair, and that she didn't know how they were going to manage. And her voice was doing that specific thing it always did when she was building toward an ask. That wavering, trembling thing that I had learned to respond to before the ask even arrived. And I said, "How much, Mom?" And she told me, and it was $400. And I said, "Okay," and I transferred it that same night. And I told myself it was a loan. I remember that very clearly. I remember sitting at my laptop and looking at my bank account after the transfer and thinking, this is a loan. She'll pay it back when things settle down. And I want to pause here and tell you something. That moment right there, that $400 transfer on a Tuesday night in September, that was the first entry in what would become the most important document of my life. I opened a spreadsheet that same night. I don't know exactly why I did it. Maybe it was the accountant in me. Maybe it was that quiet, stubborn voice again. But I opened a spreadsheet and I typed the date and the amount and the reason and the method of transfer. And I saved it in a folder I labeled simply family. And I closed my laptop and I went to bed. And I thought nothing more of it. But I never deleted that spreadsheet and I never stopped adding to it. And over the next 10 years, that spreadsheet would become something that even I couldn't have imagined that night. Something that would eventually hold the weight of an entire family's worth of choices and consequences. But I didn't know that yet. I was just a 22-year-old girl who had given her mother $400 and called it love because that was the only word I had for it. And the months went by and my father recovered, and I thought perhaps that would be the end of it, but of course it wasn't. Because once a family learns that you will give, they never stop asking. And the requests came slowly at first. The way water finds a crack in a wall slowly at first, and then all at once. My mother called in November because Diane needed money for a dentist appointment. My mother called in January because the heating bill was higher than expected. My father called in March, which was unusual because my father almost never called me directly. And he asked me gruffly and briefly for $300 because Marcus had gotten into some trouble with a landlord and needed help with a deposit for a new place. And I noticed something in those early months. I noticed that no one ever asked Marcus to help. Marcus worked at the auto shop and made decent money and lived rent-free at home for most of that first year. And no one ever knocked on his bedroom door and said, "Marcus, we need you to transfer something." And no one ever called Diane, even after Diane moved in with Troy. And Troy turned out to have a decent enough income. The calls always came to me, and when I gently pointed this out once, just once, in a phone call with my mother sometime around the 8-month mark, my mother said, "Claire, you have a real job and you know how to manage money. And Marcus is trying, and Diane is still getting settled." And those words, that sentence, became a blueprint for the next decade of my life. Because having a real job and knowing how to manage money apparently meant that I was the designated family bank. It meant that my stability was everyone else's safety net. It meant that the better I did, the more was expected of me, and the less credit I was given for it, because it was just Claire being Claire. Just Claire doing what Claire does. And here is where I need to tell you something important. Something that took me years to understand clearly. I was not giving out of pure generosity all of those times. I want to be honest about that. I was giving out of fear. Fear that if I said no, they would love me less. Fear that if I drew a boundary, they would confirm what I had always secretly suspected. That I was the least important one. That my place in this family was conditional on my usefulness. And so I gave, and I kept giving. And every time I gave, I opened that spreadsheet and I added a line, date, amount, recipient, reason, method. And slowly, without anyone knowing, without anyone suspecting, without anyone giving it a single thought, the record grew. And the years went on. I was 23, and my mother called because my father had to have a procedure, and they were short on the copay, and I sent $600. I was 24, and Marcus called me for the first time in months, his voice easy and warm the way it always was when he wanted something, and he told me he had an opportunity, a business opportunity, a chance to buy into his friend's expanded auto shop, a real stake, real ownership. He said, "Claire, this could be my thing. This could be how I finally get somewhere." And he needed $2,000. And he would pay me back with interest once the business took off, and I believed him. I want you to know that I genuinely believed him. Marcus was my big brother, and underneath all the frustration and the inequality, I still loved him. And I still wanted good things for him, so I sent the $2,000, and I put it in the spreadsheet, and I waited for the payback that never came. Marcus never mentioned the money again, not once, not in passing, not in any of the dozens of conversations we had over the following years. It simply ceased to exist in his version of events. And when I was 25, my mother called me crying harder than usual and told me that my father had lost his job at the processing plant. They were downsizing, and Raymond Mitchell had been let go after 22 years with a severance package that was insultingly small, and a handshake that my mother said he came home looking ashamed about. And I felt terrible for him. I genuinely did. Because whatever his failings as a father, my father was a man who had defined himself by his work, and losing that work was a kind of death for him. And so when my mother asked if I could help with the mortgage for a couple of months, I said yes. I said yes because I loved them. And I said yes because I was afraid. And I said yes because saying no felt like abandoning people who were drowning. Even if some part of me was starting to wonder whether they would ever learn to swim if I kept pulling them out of the water. The mortgage was $1,200 a month, and I covered it for 4 months before my father found part-time work. And my mother picked up a few hours at a dry cleaner down the street, and those 4 months alone were $4,800, and every cent of it went into the spreadsheet. And I want to stop here for a moment and ask you something. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are, have you ever been the person in your family that everyone leans on without anyone asking if you're okay? Have you ever been the one who holds everything together while quietly falling apart? Because if you have, then you know exactly what I mean. When I say that the loneliness of that position is unlike any other loneliness, it's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people who need you and still somehow being invisible. And that was my life through my mid-20s. I was working hard and getting promoted slowly and building a career with genuine discipline and focus, and every raise I got seemed to generate a new request from home, as if they had some kind of radar for when my bank account had a little more room in it. And I was 26 when something happened that shifted things in a way I hadn't expected. I met a man named Daniel Cho, a software developer who worked for a tech startup downtown. We met at a coffee shop near my office on a rainy Wednesday morning when we both reached for the last blueberry muffin at exactly the same moment and then stood there laughing about it. And Daniel was kind in a way I wasn't used to. A quiet, steady, deliberate kind of kindness. He didn't talk loudly or take up too much room, and he asked questions and actually listened to the answers. And when I told him on our third date about my family, just the broad outlines, just enough to give him some context, he listened without interrupting. And then he said, "That sounds really exhausting, Claire." And those 4 words hit me somewhere so deep that I had to look away for a moment, because no one had ever just called it exhausting before. No one had ever validated the weight of it, without telling me I should be grateful, or without reminding me that family is family. And I fell in love with Daniel slowly and then completely, and we moved in together when I was 27 and got engaged when I was 28. And I want to tell you that period was the happiest I had been in my adult life. I was in love and I was good at my job, and I had been promoted to senior accountant, and I had a person who came home to me every night and asked how my day was and meant it. And even the family requests slowed down a little during that time. Not because anything had changed, but because I was less available. I was building my own life, and I was slightly less reachable, and the slight distance seemed to create a slight pause in the pattern. But it didn't stop. It never fully stopped. My mother came to visit us once, about 3 months after Daniel and I moved in together, and she sat she sat in our apartment and looked around at our furniture and our art prints and our bookshelves. And she said, "Well, you've certainly done well for yourself, Claire," in a tone that was not quite a compliment. It had something underneath it, something that felt more like accusation than admiration. As if my having a comfortable home was something I had done at someone else's expense. And then at the end of the visit, before she left, she mentioned very casually that Diane and Troy were having some trouble. Troy had been between jobs and they were a little behind on things. And she wasn't asking for much, just wondering if I had anything to spare, and I gave her $800 and added it to the spreadsheet. And Daniel saw me at the laptop that night and asked what I was doing, and I told him, and he looked at the spreadsheet for a long moment. And he said, "Claire, how long have you been keeping this?" And I told him since beginning, nothing sinteka. He said quietly, "I think that spreadsheet is going to matter someday." And I didn't know then how right he was. Fight he was. I didn't know then that Daniel's quiet observation on a Tuesday night in our shared apartment would turn out to be one of the most prophetic things anyone had ever said to me. And the wedding happened when I was 29. It was a small wedding. We didn't have a big budget, and we didn't want a big production. We had 60 people in a rented room at a botanical garden, and there were string lights and wildflowers. And Daniel cried when I walked down the aisle, which made me cry, which made Daniel's mother cry, which made everyone laugh. And it was beautiful. It was genuinely beautiful. And my family came, and my mother wore a blue dress and sat in the front row, and my father shook Daniel's hand, and my brother Marcus made a toast that was charming and funny and made everyone laugh. And my sister Diane sat next to Troy and smiled her pretty smile. And for one evening, everything felt like maybe it was all going to be okay. Like maybe the dynamic was going to shift now that I was officially a married woman with a husband and a shared life, and someone who would notice if I disappeared into someone else's needs completely. But that hope lasted about 6 weeks. 6 weeks after the wedding, my mother called and said that Marcus's share of the auto shop had fallen through. The friend he'd bought into had sold the whole business without warning, and Marcus was out his investment and out a job. And could I please help him get back on his feet? And I sat on the edge of my bed that night after the call, and I looked at the ceiling for a long time. And I thought about the $2,000 I had already given Marcus years ago for his share of that same auto shop, the share he'd told me was going to change his life. And I thought about how he had never once paid that back and never once acknowledged it. And I felt something shift inside me. Not rage exactly, more like clarity. Like a lens that had been slightly blurred for years, was suddenly coming into focus. And I picked up my laptop and I opened the spreadsheet, and I looked at it properly for the first time in a while. Really looked at it. Added up the columns and let the number at the bottom register in my brain. And the number was $31,420 in 7 years. $31,420 had moved from my accounts into the accounts and pockets and mouths of my family members, and not a single dollar of it had ever been returned. Not a single thank you had ever been formally offered. Not a single conversation had ever been initiated about repayment. And I sat there with that number, and I felt something that was equal parts grief and something harder and colder than grief. I felt decided. I didn't blow up. I didn't call my mother back and scream. I didn't send Marcus an itemized bill. I simply made a decision, very quietly, very clearly. The way I made all my important decisions, I decided that I was going to stop. I was going to stop the bleeding. I was going to say no, but more than that, I was going to start building something that no one in my family could dismantle. Something that was entirely mine, and Daniel's. Something that would eventually make the number at the bottom of that spreadsheet look small by comparison. And I called Marcus back the next day, and I told him I was sorry about what happened with the shop, but that Daniel and I were saving for a house, and I wasn't in a position to help financially right now. And the silence on the other end of that call was very long, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice was different. The warmth was gone, the easiness was gone, and he said, "Oh, okay, Claire." Just like that. "Oh, okay, Claire." Like I had failed some test, like I had revealed something disappointing about my character. And then he said, "I guess blood only goes so far." Huh. And he hung up, and I held my phone for a moment, and I breathed, and I told myself I had done the right thing. And then my mother called 40 minutes later. And then my mother called again that evening. And by the end of the week, I had received 11 separate communications from various members of my family, all circling the same event. Claire had said no. Claire had withheld help. Claire was being selfish. Claire was acting like she was better than everyone now that she was married. And I want to tell you something about that week, because it is important for you to understand the full picture. That week was one of the hardest weeks of my life, not because of anything dramatic that happened, but because of what it felt like to hold a boundary against people who had been trained your entire life to expect you not to have one. It felt like standing in a room where the walls were pressing in from all sides, and every voice in that room was telling you that the walls were actually hugging you, and if you didn't want to be hugged, there must be something wrong with you. And I cried that week. I cried a lot. I cried on Daniel's shoulder. And Daniel held me and said, "Claire, you didn't do anything wrong." And I said, "I know, but it doesn't feel that way." And he said, "I know." And that was enough. That was enough to keep me standing. And something else happened that week that I didn't expect. When the emotional noise of it all settled slightly, I sat back down with that spreadsheet, and I felt something that surprised me. I felt grateful for it. Genuinely grateful for those 7 years of quiet record keeping. Because looking at that document was the only thing that could cut through the guilt fast enough to remind me that what had been happening was real, that it wasn't my imagination, that the pattern was documented and provable and true, regardless of how my family chose to narrate it. And I added a new section to the spreadsheet that week. Not for new transfers, because there would be no new transfers, but for the communications, the messages and the calls and the guilt trips. I started saving those too, taking screenshots, noting dates and times, because the accountant in me knew that documentation was not just about numbers, it was about pattern. And the pattern was everything. And now I want to move forward in time a little. Because here's where the story really starts to become something different. Here's where Claire stops shrinking and starts growing. Because after the falling out with my family, I threw myself into work with an intensity I hadn't allowed myself before. Partly because I needed somewhere to put the energy that had previously gone into managing everyone else's crises, and partly because something had unlocked in me, something that had been waiting behind all that obligation and guilt, a genuine hunger to see how far I could actually go if I was running towards something instead of standing still and being a resource for everyone around me. I had been at Hargrove Financial for 7 years by this point, and I was well regarded and competent, but I had been playing it safe, staying in my lane, not pushing for things, because pushing for things felt like taking up too much space, and taking up too much space had never felt like something I was allowed to do. But now I pushed. I asked for the more complex accounts. I volunteered for the projects that other people avoided because they were difficult. I started staying late, not out of anxiety, but out of genuine engagement. I found that I loved the forensic side of accounting. I loved finding the thing that didn't quite add up. I loved the moment when a pattern in numbers revealed something that the numbers themselves seemed almost to be trying to hide. And Patricia, my supervisor, noticed. She called me into her office about 8 months after I had gone quiet with my family, and she told me that there was a senior analyst position opening up, and she wanted to put my name forward. And I said yes before she finished the sentence. And I got the position, and the raise that came with it was substantial. And I sat at my new desk in my new role, and I felt something I can only describe as the first real taste of what was possible. And I want to jump ahead a little more now, because I need to tell you about the 3 years after that. The 3 years between me saying no to my family, and the thing that happened that changed everything permanently. And during those 3 years, several important things took place. The first is that Daniel and I bought a house, a real house with a yard and a kitchen that had granite countertops and windows that let in the kind of morning light I had been quietly envious of since childhood. And we put every penny we'd been saving into that house, and it was ours. And I stood in the backyard on the first mornings after we moved in with a cup of coffee, and I felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has built something real out of nothing. The second thing that happened is that I enrolled in a part-time MBA program. This was my own idea, entirely self-funded. I wanted the credential, and more than that, I wanted the knowledge. I wanted to understand business at a level that went beyond the numbers I processed every day. I wanted to understand strategy and leadership and how money actually moved through organizations and why. And the MBA was hard. It was 2 years of working full-time and studying nights and weekends and barely sleeping and leaning on Daniel heavily during the parts where I thought I might not make it. But I made it. I walked across another stage and collected another diploma. And this time, my parents were not even invited. Because we were still not speaking in any meaningful way, there had been a few surface-level communications. A birthday text here and there, a brief phone call at Christmas, but the closeness had evaporated. And I had made peace with that, not happily but honestly. And the third thing that happened during those 3 years is that I started consulting quietly at first, just helping a couple of small business owners I met through Daniel's network with their books. Cleaning up messy financial records, restructuring their accounting systems, finding inefficiencies that were costing them money they didn't know they were losing, and I was extraordinarily good at it. I had a gift for making sense of financial chaos. And the small business owners I worked with started referring me to other small business owners. And the consulting income grew from a side income to something nearly as significant as my primary salary. And somewhere in there, an idea began to take shape, something I turned over in my mind at first almost superstitiously, afraid to look at it directly in case it disappeared. But it didn't disappear. It got more concrete and more detailed and more possible looking with every month that passed. The idea was to start my own firm. A boutique accounting and financial consulting firm focused specifically on small and mid-sized businesses. I had spent enough years watching companies like Hargrove serve large corporate clients with enormous retainer fees, while small business owners were left to muddle through with inadequate support. And I knew there was a market. I knew because I was already serving it, quietly and informally and profitably. And when I told Daniel about the idea, he didn't hesitate. He said, "Let's build it." And so we did. We spent 6 months planning before we did anything official. I wrote a business plan that was 47 pages long, and Daniel read every single page and gave feedback on each one. We did market research and financial projections, and I consulted with a lawyer about the right business structure. And we set up a business bank account, and I designed a logo, and Daniel built the website. And we named the company Meridian Financial Consulting, and we launched it on a Monday morning in March, when I was 32 years old, and for the first 6 months it was terrifying. We had clients from my consulting work and a few referrals from those clients, but it wasn't enough to replace my Hargrove salary entirely, and I had left Hargrove in what felt like a leap of faith over a very large gap. And some mornings I woke up at 4 in the morning, convinced I had made a catastrophic mistake, and Daniel would be awake too because he always seemed to sense when I was spiraling, and he would say, "Claire, tell me the numbers." And I would tell him the numbers. And the numbers were actually okay. They were always actually okay. And he would say, "See," and I would say, "Yes." And I would go back to sleep. and get up 3 hours later and do the work, and the work was everything. I gave that company everything I had. I was meticulous and responsive and creative. And I developed a reputation in Columbus's small business community for being the person who could find the money people didn't know they were losing and help them build systems that actually worked. And the referrals kept coming and I kept hiring. First one part-time contractor, then a full-time junior accountant, then a second, then an office manager named Greta, who became indispensable within 3 months. And by the time I was 34, Meridian Financial Consulting had 12 employees and a client list of over 60 active businesses and annual revenue that made me sometimes have to read the number twice to believe it. And I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this to brag. I am not telling you this to perform success for anyone. I am telling you this because the growth of that company is inseparable from the story of what my family did to me. Because every time I had wanted to give up, every time the early months of the business felt impossible, I thought about that spreadsheet. I thought about $31,000 given to people who never said thank you. And I thought there is no version of this story where I go backwards. There is no version of this where I go back to being the family bank while my own dreams wait on hold. And that thought, as painful as its origin was, kept me moving forward on days when nothing else did. And life went on, and it was a good life. Daniel's startup was acquired when I was 33, and he made enough from that to pay off our house and invest the rest. And he started a new project he was genuinely passionate about. And we talked about children and decided we were content with just us and our house and our dog, a rescue golden retriever named Fig, and we traveled and we had friends. And we built something that felt like actual safety. Not the performed safety of pretending everything is fine, but the real safety of knowing that even if something goes wrong, you have the capacity and the resources and the partner to handle it. And during all of this, I had not heard from my family in any meaningful way. We were at the occasional text stage. We had seen each other briefly at my father's retirement party 2 years before, which had been civil in the particular way that family events are civil when everyone is pretending not to remember things. My mother had hugged me and told me I looked good and asked vaguely about work. And I had said it was going well, and she had said that's nice, and moved on to refill Diane's glass. And Marcus had talked to me for about 4 minutes at that party. 4 minutes of surface pleasantries before his attention moved elsewhere. And I had driven home afterward and cried in the car, not out of sadness really, but out of a kind of exhausted grief for the relationship that had never been what I needed it to be and probably never would be. And I thought that was where we would stay, in that particular purgatory of polite distance, civil but not close, connected by blood but separated by everything that blood couldn't fix. And then I was 36, and my father had a heart attack. It was serious enough to land him in the ICU for 5 days, and serious enough to change things, not because of the heart attack itself, but because of what happened in the weeks after it. My father survived. He came home on medications and restrictions, and a new fragility that was hard to watch in a man who had always presented himself as immovable. And my mother called me properly for the first time in years, a long call, not asking for money, just talking. And something in me responded to it, some old loyalty that I thought I had razzed myself out of. And I started talking to my mother again, regularly, not warmly exactly, but genuinely, checking in on my father's recovery, answering the calls, and that reopening of communication was the crack that let everything else back in. Because within 3 months of my father's heart attack, the requests started again. They came more carefully this time, more indirectly. My mother would mention in passing that things were tight on my father's disability payment. She would mention that Marcus was going through something. She would mention that Diane and Troy had split up. And Diane was struggling, and I listened, and I expressed sympathy, and I did not offer money, and I waited to see whether the asking would come. And it came one evening in a phone call from my mother where she said very directly that Marcus had gotten into serious debt. She didn't specify what kind. She was vague in the way she was always vague when the details were embarrassing. She just said he needed help and they couldn't help him. And she was asking me. And this time the number was not $400 or $2,000. This time the number she said was $15,000. $15,000. And I was quiet for a moment after she said it. And she said, "Claire, are you there?" And I said, "Yes, Mom, I'm here." And she said, "I know it's a lot, but you've done so well and you have the company now, and family has to take care of family. And there it was, that sentence. Family has to take care of family, the sentence that had cost me $31,000 over 7 years. And I want to tell you that when I heard it this time, I did not feel guilt. I did not feel that old familiar pull toward obligation. I felt very calm. I felt the way I imagine a surgeon feels when the procedure they've been preparing for finally begins. Everything goes quiet and focused and clear. And I said, "Mom, I need a few days to think about this." And she said, "Of course, honey, take your time." And I hung up and I went to my office in our house and I opened the spreadsheet. I opened the old spreadsheet and I opened the new folder where I had been saving communications since the falling out. And I looked at everything, all of it. And I opened a new document and I started writing a letter. Not a letter I was going to send that day, just a letter I needed to write so that I was clear about what I was going to do and why. And what I wrote was this. I wrote that I had spent the last 10 years becoming someone my family never believed I could be, someone my family had consistently treated as a resource rather than a person. I wrote that I had documentation of every dollar, every request, every communication, and that the total, including the recent years of resumed contact and smaller amounts I hadn't mentioned, amounted to just over $34,000. And I wrote that I was done. I was done in a very specific way, not the dramatic, explosive done that I had sometimes imagined in my most frustrated moments, but done in the quiet, deliberate way of someone who has finally finished reading a very long document and closed it permanently. And then something happened that I could not have scripted even if I had wanted to. Something that made the situation not just personal, but public. And this is the part of the story that I know is going to make some of you put your hands over your mouths. Because about 2 weeks after my mother's call, I got a message from a cousin named Renee. Renee was my father's niece, and we had always liked each other from a distance. She was a warm, no-nonsense woman who had always been kind to me at family gatherings, and Renee's message said, "Claire, I don't know if you know this, but your mom and Marcus and Diane have been telling the whole family that you're rich and that you refuse to help your parents even though they're struggling." Renee said that at a recent family gathering, my mother had cried and told everyone that she had raised me and sacrificed for me. And now that I had money, I had turned my back on the family, that I was cold and selfish, and that success had changed me. Renee said that several relatives who I barely saw had been nodding along and agreeing, and that the narrative that had been built about me in the extended family was of a woman who had forgotten where she came from. And I read that message 3 times, and I felt something I want to describe to you carefully, because it was not what you might expect. I did not feel devastated. I had already processed enough of this family's dynamics to not be destroyed. By hearing that they were misrepresenting me to others, what I felt was something that I can only describe as the specific alertness of someone who has just been handed the exact justification they needed to finally act. Because here was the thing. As long as the story of what had happened between me and my family was private, as long as it was just a painful family disagreement that I was processing quietly, the only option was to continue processing it quietly. But the moment my mother chose to take that story public, the moment she chose to perform her grief to an audience, she changed the rules. She had moved this out of the private space where I might have stayed silent indefinitely, and into a shared family space where other people's perceptions were being deliberately shaped against me. And I thought about that for 3 days. I thought about it very carefully, and then I made a series of decisions, and I made them methodically and without anger. Because anger would have made me sloppy, and I could not afford to be sloppy. I called my lawyer, a woman named Sarah Hendricks, who had handled some contract work for Meridian, and who I trusted completely, and I told her the whole store theory, every detail, and she listened, and then she said, "Claire, I want to see that spreadsheet," and I sent it to her. And she called me back 2 hours later and said, "This is extraordinary documentation." And I said, "I know." And she said, "What do you want to do?" And I told her, and she said, "Let's get started." And what we did was this. Sarah drafted a formal demand letter, not for repayment. I had given up on repayment long ago, but a letter that formally documented the financial history, and that stated clearly that any further public misrepresentation of my character or financial history would be met with legal action. The letter was precise and professional, and included a summary of the documentation I held, and it was addressed to my mother and copied to Marcus and Diane, and I did not send it immediately. I wanted to do one more thing first. I wanted to have a conversation, a real conversation. Because whatever had happened and however much I had processed it, there was still a part of me that believed in the possibility of honesty between people who had once loved each other even imperfectly. And so I called my mother and I told her I wanted to meet, just the two of us, and she agreed, and we met at a neutral place, a coffee shop neither of us had any particular connection to. And I arrived first, and I sat at a corner table, and I put my phone face down on the table and I waited. And my mother came in looking smaller than I remembered. She had aged in a way that the occasional holiday photo had not quite conveyed. And she sat down across from me and we ordered coffees. And there was a moment of ordinary smallness before I started. And I said, "Mom, I want to talk honestly." And she said, "Okay." And I said, "I know what you've been telling people." And she was quiet and I said, "I'm not here to fight about it. I'm here because I want you to understand something before this goes any further." And she said, "What?" And I said that I have records, complete records, of every dollar I gave this family over 10 years. And she started to say something and I said, "Please, let me finish." And I told her the number, the full number, and I watched her face change. I watched something move through her expression that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't shame exactly. It was more complex than shame. It was the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a version of events in their head for as long that having the real version placed in front of them is physically disorienting. And she said, "Claire, we were struggling." And I said, "I know." And I said, "I never once refused to help when you were genuinely in crisis. I gave everything I could for years." And I said, "But here is what I need you to hear. I was not a bank. I was your daughter. And you never once treated me the way you treated Marcus or Diane. Not when we were children and not as adults. And every time I gave money, you treated it as something I owed you rather than something I chose to give you." And she started to cry, and I sat with it. I sat with her tears, without rushing to comfort her the way I would have 10 years ago, because I had learned that my mother's tears were often a tool, not always consciously. Not with malice, but as a mechanism for ending conversations that had gotten too honest. And I said, "Mom, I love you. I want you to know that. And I also need you to know that I am done being defined by other people's version of my story." And I pushed a folder across the table to her, a printed summary of the documentation. And I said, "This is what I have." And I said, "The lawyer who prepared that letter you're going to receive next week is ready to take this further. If the public narrative about me continues." And I said, "I hope it doesn't come to that, because I would rather we figure out a way to actually be honest with each other than spend the next chapter of our lives in conflict." And my mother was very quiet for a long time. And then she said, "I didn't know it was that much." And I said, "I know. And that's the problem, Mom. You never once asked." And she looked at the printed summary, and she looked at me, and she said, "I'm sorry, Claire. And I want to tell you that those words landed somewhere real. Even though I knew they came years too late. And even though I knew that sorry was not the same as change, but they landed. They were real. I could see that. And I said, thank you for that." And I paid for the coffees, and I drove home, and I sat in my car in the driveway for a while before going inside. And when I went inside, Daniel was cooking dinner, and Fig was sleeping near the back door, and I stood in my kitchen. And I looked at everything in it, and I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled. For so long I had forgotten what settled felt like. And then the thing that I had not quite planned for happened. 3 days after the meeting with my mother, Marcus called me. Not my mother calling on his behalf, but Marcus himself, directly. And his voice was not easy and warm and charming, the way it usually was when he was angling for something. His voice was uncertain. And he said, "Claire, can we talk?" And I said yes, and there was a silence, and then he said, "I've been thinking a lot about things." And I said, "What things?" And he said, "About the money. All of it. I didn't know Mom had asked you for so much over the years. I didn't know how much it added up to." And I said, "Marcus, you borrowed $2,000 from me, directly for the auto shop, and never mentioned it again." And he was quiet. And then he said, "I know." And I said, "What do you want to say about that?" And he said, "I want to say I'm sorry, and that I should have paid you back, and that I'm ashamed that I didn't. And I want to tell you that those words from Marcus were harder to hear than my mother's apology had been, because Marcus and I had once been closer before the favoritism and the resentment had built up between us." And hearing real shame in his voice made something in my chest ache in a way that I hadn't expected. And I said, "Thank you, Marcus, and I mean that." And he said, "I know you have no reason to help us now." And I said, "You're right, I don't." And I said, "But I want to tell you something. I'm not doing this to punish any of you. I'm doing it because I needed to stop disappearing into what other people needed and start building something for myself and Daniel. And the company and the life we have are proof that I could do that. And I said, none of this erases what happened between us, but I hope that eventually we can find our way to something more honest than what we had before. And Marcus said, yeah, me too. And we talked for another few minutes about nothing much. And then we said goodbye. And I think it was the most honest conversation I had ever had. And Diane called the next week. Diane, who had always been my mother's favorite. Diane, who had gotten the window room and the new clothes and the patient explanations. Diane, who had never once in our adult lives expressed any awareness of the inequality she had benefited from. And Diane cried on the phone and said things that were not quite apologies, but were at least acknowledgments. And I listened. And I said, I hear you, Diane. And I said, I'm not asking any of you to repay the money, because I know that's not possible, and because that's not actually the point. The point is, I need the story about me to stop. The false narrative has to stop. And Diane said, I'll talk to Mom, and I said, thank you. And we hung up and I sat with all of it. The 3 conversations in 2 weeks. The apologies and the half apologies and the acknowledgments. And I tried to decide what I thought. What I genuinely thought separate from the old programming that said forgive and smooth it over and go back to giving. And what I decided was this: I was willing to have a relationship with my family, a real one, a boundaried one where I was treated as a person and not a resource. But I was not willing to pretend the past hadn't happened, and I was not willing to silently absorb the cost of everyone else's choices anymore. And, about 6 weeks after all of that, something happened that I absolutely did not expect. My father called me. My father, who almost never called me. My father, who communicated through my mother as a rule. My father, Raymond, with his bad back and his new heart medication and his retired man's quiet days. He called me on a Sunday afternoon, and he said, Claire, it's Dad. And I said, I know, Dad. And he said, I wanted to call you myself this time. And I said, okay. And he said, I heard what your mother said to you, and I heard what Marcus told me. And I want you to know that I know I wasn't always fair to you. I know you didn't always get what you should have gotten from me and your mother. And his voice was rough and uncomfortable, the way my father's voice always got when he was saying something that mattered to him. And he said, I'm not good at this kind of thing. And I said, I know, Dad. And he said, but I'm proud of you. I should have told you that more. I should have told you that always. You were always the strongest one. And I said, you know what's funny, Dad, is that you telling me I was the strong one was the reason no one ever thought to take care of me, because if you're the strong one, then everyone assumes you don't need anything. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, that's fair, and I said, it is. And then I said, I love you, Dad. And he said, I love you too, kiddo. And we talked for a few more minutes about nothing much. And then we said goodbye, and I hung up and I cried properly, really cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from pain, but the kind that comes from relief. The specific relief of having the truth acknowledged by the person whose acknowledgement you needed most, even 20 years too late. And I don't want to tie this up too neatly, because life doesn't tie up neatly, and neither does family. What happened after all of those conversations was not a Hollywood reconciliation. It was not a tearful gathering where everyone hugged and the past was forgiven, and we all moved forward beaming. What happened was something slower and more real and more sustainable than that. My mother and I rebuilt something, gradually, imperfectly. A relationship with actual honesty in it. She stopped asking for money, and I stopped waiting for the ask. We started talking about real things instead of orbiting each other carefully. She told me once, about a year after our coffee shop conversation, that she had always known I was going to be the one who made something of herself. And she was afraid that made her treat me harder instead of better. And I said, I understand that, Mom, even though it hurt. And she said, I know. And we sat with that together, and that was enough. Marcus paid me back $200 once, just 200, clearly as a gesture, rather than as any real accounting. And I laughed when the transfer came through, because the gesture was so Marcus-like and so inadequate, and so genuine all at the same time. And I told him thank you, and we left it there. And Diane and I were never going to be close. I accepted that we were too different, and the gap in how we had been treated had created a chasm that neither of us fully knew how to cross. But we were polite and occasionally warm, and that was better than what we'd had. And Meridian Financial Consulting kept growing. We hit 8 figures in annual revenue when I was 37. And I was written up in a Columbus Business Journal and interviewed for a podcast about women entrepreneurs. And I sat in the studio for that podcast recording. And the host asked me what had been the turning point for me professionally. And I thought about the real answer. I thought about my 22-year-old self opening a spreadsheet on a Tuesday night after transferring $400 she didn't have to her mother. And I said think the turning point was learning that my stability was not the same as everyone else's safety net. And the host nodded thoughtfully and said, "That's a powerful distinction." And I said, "It took me a while to make it." And she said, "How long?" And I said, "About 10 years." And she said, "Wow." And I said, "Yes." And we moved on. And I want to tell you where I am now. I am 38 years old. I am sitting in my glass-walled office on the 14th floor, and the view is extraordinary. The city spreads out below me in all directions, and I know that somewhere in this city is the house on Delmore Street, and the kitchen that always smelled like something burning, and the boiler room where I slept in the cold, and I feel something when I think about that. Not bitterness, not triumph. Something more complicated and more human than either of those. Something like gratitude mixed with grief. Gratitude for the person I became partly because of what I survived, and grief for the girl who had to survive it. And if you're listening to this right now and you recognize something of your own story in mine, if you have been the responsible one, the strong one, the one everyone leans on without asking if you're okay, if you have given and watched the giving be taken for granted and called love, I want to say something to you very directly. Document everything, not because you're planning revenge, not because you're building a case, but because the truth matters and your experience is real and the numbers do not lie even when the people do. And also, I want to say this. Building boundaries is not the same as building walls. I still have a relationship with my family. I still love them in the complicated, incomplete way that I imagine most people love families that have hurt them. But I love them from a place of clarity now. I love them knowing exactly what happened and why, and what I am and am not willing to accept going forward. And that clarity, that hard-won, completely undeniable clarity, is worth more to me than any amount of harmony that came from pretending. And Daniel still asks how my day was every single evening when we sit down for dinner. And Fig is getting older and slower and still sleeps near the back door. And our house still has the countertops and the windows with the morning light. And all of it feels real in a way that nothing in my childhood home ever quite felt. And the spreadsheet still exists. I haven't deleted it. I don't think I ever will. Not because I look at it regularly, but because I believe in keeping records. I believe in the power of documentation. I believe in knowing your own history precisely and completely, especially when other people have a vested interest in blurring it. And the last entry in that spreadsheet, the last one I ever made in the ongoing log, was dated the same week I had the coffee shop conversation with my mother. And after the amount column, which I left blank, and after the reason column where I typed final accounting, I wrote one more thing in the notes field. I wrote, "This is not the end of the story. This is the end of that chapter." And I closed the laptop and I have not opened that file again since. And I think that is exactly right, because a record is only as powerful as what you do with it. And what I chose to do with mine was not to weaponize it, not to destroy anyone with it, but to use it as the evidence I needed to finally believe my own experience, to finally stop second-guessing whether the weight I had been carrying was real, to finally look at the numbers and say, yes, this happened, and I survived it, and I built something extraordinary in spite of it, or maybe because of it, and either way I am here, I am standing. I have my name on a lease and a husband who loves me and a dog who sleeps near the back door. And for the first time in a very long time, I do not owe anyone anything except the truth. And the truth is this: you cannot pour from an empty cup. And love is not a transaction, and family is not a debt you spend your whole life paying. And the moment you finally believe those three things completely and stop waiting for permission to believe them, is the moment your actual life begins. And mine began. It began on a Tuesday night when I was 22 years old, and I opened a spreadsheet and typed the first entry. And it took 10 years for that entry to mean what it was always going to mean. But it meant something. It meant everything. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, wondering whether your record keeping is worth it, or whether your boundaries are too hard, or whether the people who are supposed to love you will ever see you clearly, I want to tell you from the other side of it, from the 14th floor of a building, with my name on the lease, looking out at a city for once made me feel invisible. Keep going, document everything, build something they cannot take from you, and never let anyone call your survival selfish. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it found you at exactly the right time. And if it resonated with something in your own life, I would love to know about it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and what part of this story hit you hardest. And if you believe that truth deserves to be told, and that dignity is always worth fighting for, then subscribe. Because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is about people who were underestimated, and who made the underestimators irrelevant. I will see you in the next one.